A can-do movie is a movie that just insists on being made. It doesn't care what kind of resources it lacks. It will get finished. And why do I like can-do movies? It's because I've made a couple of them myself.
Hey, we're returning to Frank Hennenlotter again, and this time we're covering what might be, no, not what might be, what is my favorite Frank Hennenlotter movie, and that's Brain Damage from 1988, written and directed by Frank Hennenlotter, which is kind of his MO. He usually writes and directs his stuff. I don't know if he's ever directed anything he hasn't written or written anything he hasn't directed. I'm clueless on that, but that's my experience with the guy. And it's starring Rich Hurst, who's mostly a soap opera actor. He's been in like all the 80s soap operas. He was in Guiding Light, One Life to Live, Ryan's Hope, I don't know, stuff like that if you're under 50, you don't know what I'm talking about kind of stuff. And it also features the voice of John Zacherle. And John Zacherle was like a classic 1950s horror movie host, like in the golden age of horror movie hosts on television and such. And he kind of had like a zombie vibe. He sort of crossed the line between a zombie and a vampire a little bit with his vibe, but his voice is golden and downright mellifluous, and it works so good here. And something cool about this is it has what I call an all-star can-do crew, because all the people in the crew here had some pretty cool can-do movies on the resume. For example, the Steadicam operator was the guy who directed Street Trash. The assistant director of Brain Damage is the guy who directed Slime City. Maybe not as well known as Street Trash, but it's a reasonable credit there. The guy who did the effects, I think his name's Bartolo or Bartolos, but he did the effects on Spookies, which is a really cool can-do movie. If you haven't seen it, check out Spookies. And as I said before, this is my favorite Frank Hennenlotter film, so much so that I've got a tattoo inspired by this movie. I think you can see it pretty good right there. But that's my little Elmer. Now, Basket Case was shot on 16 millimeter, but Frank Hennenlotter's working on 35 millimeter this time, and it shows. The movie definitely looks more polished than Basket Case. That's not always a plus in my twisted mind, but he still finds a way to get that can-do aesthetic to go through the 35 millimeter film, off the screen, in your eyes, and to your brain. He had a $1.5 million budget this time, which is, I don't have to tell you, that's substantially higher than the 35 grand he used on Basket Case. That's a whole lot more than 35 grand that he used on Basket Case. But the can-do ethos still shows through, because Frank Hennenlotter doesn't see can-do as a restriction. He sees it as an aspiration, part of why I love him so much. And no matter what the budget is, he wants to communicate that he's doing as much his way as he can. Practical effects, puppetry, there's a little bit of post effects in here that actually work better here than they did in Cellar Dweller that I talked about a couple weeks ago. Now, the motivation for this story is that a guy gets addicted to a creature's juice, and then he'll do whatever it takes to keep that juice flowing. Now, obviously, I've always thought of this movie as a metaphor for addiction, a metaphor for drug use, but Frank Hennenlotter had a little something different to say about his inspiration for it. Hennenlotter said he used addiction as a metaphor for a bigger problem in life, which is escapism, avoidance, just turning your back on your problems, pretending they don't exist, however that may be. It might be from making YouTube videos, I don't know. But he wants to talk about those dangers of isolation and escapism. Somewhat of a parallel with Basket Case, but a new look at it. And he says more that this movie is about why he becomes addicted and not what the addiction is or what the addiction does to him. And I think that that makes this a story that's a little bit ahead of its time. But just the same, I'm going to talk about this movie a whole lot as a presentation of addiction, a metaphor for addiction, because it's just so obvious and you really got to address it. Now, the movie opens with like these diagrams of Grey's Anatomy. And I'm talking about the book, not the TV show, like the medical text, nice anatomical graphs about what the different parts of the body is, and illustrations that will show what the body would look like if you remove the skin. Those kind of things. I got a copy of Grey's Anatomy, didn't bring it up here with me, but I recognize that right away. And then the camera pulls out and you realize you're in a doctor's office, which is an interesting way to start this movie, if you ask me. And you also see this doctor, and who I assume is his wife, like they're getting excited for their fix. They're all talking about, woohoo, we're gonna get it, we're gonna do this, we're gonna do that. But then they go to the bathtub where they keep whatever it is that provides their fix. We haven't seen it yet. And they absolutely freak out because it's not there. I don't mean freak out a little bit. They're full on nutso because that thing's not there. And then later on, we see him lying on the floor, foaming at the mouth in tremors and things. And it really tells us there's a pretty vicious withdrawal from whatever this is. And then there's a 20-something-year-old guy who's lives downstairs, I guess, from where they live in the same apartment building. Kind of weird that a doctor's office and like a bachelor pad where two brothers are living together in the same building. But you know, it's New York. Real estate's expensive. You do what you got to do to make it work, don't you? But he cancels on his girlfriend because he's having what I'll call some flu-like symptoms, and he asks his brother to take her out to the concert or whatever their plans were. Now back to this setup, we see the doctor and his wife going through their withdrawals, having their problems, and then we see this kid who is totally different from the doctor and his wife. And I think that Frank Hennenlotter here is making a pretty clear position statement that addiction doesn't discriminate based on age, based on financial status, based on income, education. Addiction visits everyone if we let it. Everyone's at risk of this little creature in the movie. And also I feel like Brian's introduction is kind of showing us that the first thing that suffers in addiction or escapism or isolation, but specifically in this movie I'm going to say addiction, is that it interferes with your relationships. Personal relationships are the first thing to start to unravel a little bit. And I also started thinking the guy's name is Brian. And then for some reason, my mind goes to the title of the movie is Brain Damage, but you flip those two letters in the middle and it becomes Brian Damage. And that kind of works too. As you watch this, it's Brian that gets more and more damaged as the film goes along, but also it happens via his brain or brainstem or whatever you want to call it. But the guy starts having all these brightly colored hallucinations. Like he sees purple water coming down on the ground. The walls, they start to glow a little bit, turn sort of a magenta, that sort of thing. Just vivid colors everywhere. And he doesn't know what's happening exactly. But then we meet the source of the high. There's this worm-like creature. You know, he feels some blood on the back of his head. He doesn't know what happened. And then the worm-like creature introduces itself. And once again, this is what I mean by worm-like creature. This little guy right here. It turns out that this worm guy puts a needle-like appendage. I mean, very clearly looks like a needle and drips some fluid that he calls his juice out onto the guy's brain. Basically shoots him up. And it's so much so a metaphor for needle, IV drug use, is that it even leaves needle tracks on the back of his head when he pulls his hair up and kind of is looking in the mirror and we, the audience, can see the needle tracks. I mean, they're going pretty obvious here on what they're aiming for despite what Hennenlotter says. And turns out the first hit's free. You know, he just gave him that one so that he'd see what it feels like and know the euphoria that goes along with it. But then after that first hit, he has to start paying for it, which, you know, first hit's free is something I've heard a lot. But the currency here isn't money. The currency's human brains, because at the end of the day, the sole source of food for this little creature, human brains, kind of reminds me of Venom from the Venom movies, even the parasitic relationship there, or at least symbiotic, I guess would be more appropriate with Venom, even though it really is parasitic here with this creature. But I don't know if he ever tried to feed him chocolate, because I know that works for Venom somehow. Now, as far as this creature goes, and the creature design, and the puppet, and the figures that they use for it, I'm just going to say it has a lot of phallic features when you look at it. The brain on it looks kind of like it could be hanging brain. I don't know if you know what hanging brain means, but it looks kind of scrotalistic is what I'll say. Very much like, like the dangly part on a dog that hasn't been fixed. Also, this little creature's usually kind of floppy. You know, just kind of floppy, you might even say flaccid. But then when it goes into action, when it starts killing somebody, it gets very rigid. So yeah, not so subtle allusions there to male anatomy, if you will. And also something else about kind of the sexual nature of this, which is a hallmark of Hennenlotter movies for better or worse, depending on where you stand on it. But whenever the creature is giving its juice to Brian, he's definitely making an O face. I mean, there's no two ways around it. If your wife, your roommate, your kids walk in at the wrong time, they're really going to think you're watching a dirty movie. Which, you know, they're not wrong. This movie's kind of dirty, but I like it. There's also a part where Elmer is hiding down into his pants, just in case you didn't catch the analogy here. And in order to get some brains, he gets a lady to service him with oral pleasure. She sucks on Elmer like she has bills to pay and the light's going to get shut off tomorrow. So once again, pretty obvious parallel for what Hennenlotter's going here for with this creature. It's also kind of veiny. I don't think I need to elaborate on that. So definitely phallic. We can all agree on that. But there's more, as Ron Popeil used to say. It has a dark color, like a darkish blue color, that you usually don't see in skin. It's not sort of a natural skin-like pigment, but you might see it in other things that are out in the bathroom. And more specifically, this little creature loves to spend its time in the bathroom. The bathroom's kind of where it lives, it's a bit of a floater, if you will. And Brian likes to have privacy when he's doing it. Oftentimes he's sitting on the toilet when he's interacting with this creature. So I've always kind of interpreted this creature as starting out phallic and then becoming fecal as it goes on. But I say that even though the puppet's appearance doesn't change, but sort of the contextual things that you see. More and more things start occurring in the bathroom pretty quickly on. And I also kind of see sort of a metaphor there for it having that dualistic nature, because Frank Hennenlotter and a lot of the male viewers would probably associate a phallus with fun or with pleasure, in some way a positive thing. Most people that I know of want to keep their phallus for their entire life. But then the creature turns into something foul. It looks like excrement, waste, a literal piece of shit. And I think he's saying how what starts out as a party turns into garbage. Your life goes to squat at some point. Just to elaborate, in case I haven't said enough, phallus in your pants, usually acceptable. Turd in your pants, you got a problem. So to settle the debate, I read an interview with the guy who actually made the creature. And this guy said that Hennenlotter told him to make it look like a black dildo. So I guess that settles any debate I had as to what he was intending the creature to look like, right? But then he was also told to make it look a little bit like a turd. So I guess it's both, and maybe I'm right, patting myself on the back for that one. I always love it when me and Frank H are on the same page. And as far as this creature's concerned, there's a lot of interesting things to it beyond the look and the metaphor. You can't ignore this creature's voice provided by John Zachary. It is so wonderful. It's so different than what you'd expect. Maybe got a little bit of Michigan J. Frog going on there. But it's this rich, comforting voice. It has very friendly tones, and it really is the kind of thing to encourage you to trust it. It sounds like a trustworthy voice, even though maybe it's a deception, we find out as this movie continues. So at some point, the doctor corners Brian. He wants to get the creature back. And we find out the creature's name is Aylmer. Not Elmer, Aylmer. The doctor even spells it out. Aylmer, though everybody pronounces it like Elmer. A lot of the promotional stuff says Elmer. Even in the credits, he's credited as Elmer, like Elmer Fudd. But the doctor guy also says that Elmer means renowned or famous person. And I didn't know if this was kind of a Frank Hennenlotter creation or if it was true, so I looked the word up. This is the age of Google, where it's a lot easier to do than it was in 1988 when this movie was made. Turns out it's right. That's what Aylmer means. There's even like a member of the peerage in the United Kingdom that's like the Duke of Aylmer or something like that. Or maybe it's Baron. I don't know. He also gives a pretty interesting history lesson about how the Aylmer, as he calls it, was around during the latter days of the Eastern Roman Empire in Byzantium. It also talks about how it's passed through all these various notable historical moments and somehow winds up with a doctor whose office is in a flop house in New York. I don't know how you connect those dots there, but I'm a sucker for history, so I really like tying all that in. And one more thing about the name, that name Aylmer, A-Y-L, pronounced Elmer. I'm just being a little bit over-enunciating there. But A-Y-L sounds a little bit like ailment, A-I-L. So I think there might be a little subconscious communication there, that it sounds at first like a prestigious person. It sounds like a good time, and then it turns into sickness, that ailment. Sort of the way that Elmer generally travels here is he rides on Brian's back. He injects at the base of his skull there, at his upper cervical spine. And you can see that almost being like the literal monkey on his back. I don't know if folks these days still use that term, but it was a popular term for addiction, was you got that monkey on your back. And of course, the needle injection certainly brings to mind heroin as the drug that's being analogued here. But Hennenlotter himself said it was inspired by his cocaine addiction. Can you believe a movie maker in the 80s was addicted to cocaine? And something else to keep in mind about 1988 historical context, particularly for people who didn't live through it or weren't particularly old when it happened. But we had this thing called the crack epidemic at the time. It was big on the news. I had this feeling like it was obvious from watching TV that pretty much all kinds of people were on crack. Everybody was on crack, except for the fact I never met anyone who was on crack. So I don't know how much of an epidemic it really was, how much it was overblown, but it was definitely on the news, definitely an influence in 1988. And it was also during Nancy Reagan's Just Say No campaign, which I think is an ineffective way to approach addiction, substance abuse, because it's like, I don't want to be addicted. What do I do? Just say no. Not that easy, is it? I probably shouldn't do drugs. What do I do? Just say no. All my friends are doing drugs. Just say no. I don't know how effective that was. In fact, we probably have some pretty good statistics that it was not effective. And one reviewer of this movie, based on where it goes and how it ends, he said that this movie was communicating to its audience that there's only one cure for heroin addiction, and that cure is death. I think that's a pretty grim and nihilistic view. I'm so glad that he's not necessarily right on that, because, I've seen some people come back from that, and I'm very proud of them. And also, as far as all the sexual imagery, the stranger hookups and things, in the 1980s, we were scared to death of HIV and AIDS. I mean, the Surgeon General at the time, C. Everett Koop, sent every single family in America a letter explaining what AIDS was and how to prevent it and stuff like that. So you can imagine you're a late elementary school, early middle school kid, and you grab this letter and you're reading some pretty graphic details on what to do and what not to do. And some of those what not to do things, I was like, oh, I never thought of that. I need to try it. I don't know how effective it was. But the point is, there was no treatment. There was definitely no cure. It was a death sentence, and the death came quickly, and it was not a pleasant death. So there's a whole lot of fear of HIV and AIDS and showing people getting killed due to sexual encounters. Maybe that carried a little bit of that sentiment over with it. Because this movie clearly equates sex with death, and not in the way a slasher movie does. It's not like Halloween, Friday the 13th. This is literally the sex itself that's killing people. So once again, that goes back to that communicable disease theory I have. But in the end, the girlfriend dies because she's trying to save him. And I think, that's saying somebody's addicted, you got to get out of their way, let them hit bottom and get treatment. Trying to save somebody usually hurts you more than it helps them. And they make no secret of that here. And then Elmer also dies, the little creature, because there's a fight, near the climax where the doctor with a gun confronts Brian and they fight over Elmer, and he grabs Elmer and squeezes him, trying to, like tug of war, get him away. So much that Elmer dies. And then the doctor dies. And eventually Brian dies. So this is kind of like, once you get into this world, everybody dies. So the best thing you can do is exit it as soon as you see it coming, if possible. So at the end, Brian self-destructs. He takes his own life. He shoots himself in the head with a handgun, and the top of his head blows open, and there's all this bright light just shining up, just glaring everywhere. I'm not quite sure I know what that metaphor is. I don't know what Frank Hennenlotter is saying there, but it looks cool. Maybe he's not saying anything. Maybe he said this would look cool. But that is kind of our grand finale that can be a little puzzling. Maybe some lightning bolts are going up there, but no real clear understanding, by me at least, of what he's saying with that scene, but quite memorable. Now, this story's been compared to Faust, and I don't know if you're familiar with Faust, but that's a guy who sells his soul to the devil for knowledge. And, addiction's kind of like selling your soul to the devil for some other kind of intellectual stimulation. And also, just like Basket Case, this movie is a study in codependency, only instead of it being a family member or another individual where this codependency exists, the codependent relationship is with substances, with the monkey on his back, with Elmer. Like I said, this is codependency with the juice and not with a family member. Another parallel with Basket Case is that the creature kills the main character. It's hard to call him a protagonist, but the main character's love interest gets killed by the creature. Same thing happens in Basket Case. And the parallels are so strong, just to make sure that the viewer knows this is a parallel of what happened in Basket Case. Dwayne from Basket Case shows up on the subway holding a big wicker basket on his lap minutes before the death occurs. That's what you call a little too on the nose. The parallels are so strong that at least one reviewer called this more of a sequel to Basket Case than Basket Case 2 actually was. And again, Just like Basket Case, this movie works because it's talking about the human condition. And I know that sounds grandiose, but the human condition usually isn't grandiose. It's usually low and base. Like we're seeing people in Skid Row, in flop houses, we're seeing people with addiction. But then we're also seeing some doctors. We have doctors as targets in Basket Case. We have a doctor who's sort of in an antagonistic role here in Brain Damage. So it's clear that, the same problems that affect the lower end of the social scale can also affect the upper end. And that is the human condition, problems that we all share in Frank Hennenlotter's eye. So some high points on this movie. And given that this is my favorite Hennenlotter movie, maybe one of my favorite movies of all time, I had to narrow it down to 3, just like last week. But I will say in this movie, the stop motion is much better than it was in Basket Case. So I'm really glad to see that, even though there's a little bit of a time capsule in that horrible stop motion in Basket Case. It's something memorable that you won't see anywhere else. But here I was glad they got it to the standard 12 frames per second at the very least. John Zacherle's voice. Oh, I just love the comforting tones, and I love how against expectations, or how much it subverts what you think a creature's voice would sound like, and how that voice can just earn your trust. I love that voice. I never knew who John Zacherle was before I saw Brain Damage, but now I'll never forget him. And once again, the depths of the metaphors. Last time I said Basket Case was thematically rich. Well, this one, it's more the depth of the metaphors. They work in more than one way. Layers and layers and layers. You start with this metaphor, get down to this one, then at the base you get to the larger one. I like a movie like that. One that you can watch a few times and it feels new in some way. And of course, they got warts. Even this wonderful movie has some warts. And one isn't really the movie's fault. It isn't Frank Hennenlotter's fault, but it will distract from your enjoyment of the movie. And there's a lot of misinterpretation on what this movie means, at least according to Frank Hennenlotter. I certainly don't agree with what everybody thinks about it, and I don't know if anybody agrees with what I think about it, but that is kind of one of the drawbacks, but it does make conversation interesting if you can keep from getting in a fight. Another pet peeve of mine are shadows at night. They're definitely unavoidable in an earlier time where you have to use lighting or else the image is just going to look black. But this is a guy where there's no street lights to motivate the shadows, because that will help out. There's no way that a full moon is going to create the level of shadows that we're seeing here. So that always pulls me out a little bit. It's a nitpick, but it is a pet peeve. Overall, though, the lighting's so much better than Basket Case. And then my final wart with this movie is that I still don't know what to think of the ending. I'm not quite sure what it means. I feel like it does mean something. I'm going to have to watch it a few more times and think on it some more, but compared to how clear the ending of Basket Case is to me, this one is offering a metaphor that I'm just not catching, I suppose. But the final word. With Frank Hennenlotter, he went from awesome at Basket Case to even awesomer with Brain Damage. So I absolutely love it. And yet again, that means we're going to get 5 out of 5 Ed Woods.